Chapter 1. Introduction. The Day That Changed Europe. In the early morning of June 6, 1944, a gray sky lies over the coast of Normandy. The sea is choppy. A cold wind drives the waves to the beaches. But what is brewing in these hours is much more than just a military maneuver. It is the beginning of an operation that would change the fate of the world. Off the French coast lies the largest invasion fleet that mankind has ever seen. Thousands of ships, from huge battleships to small landing craft, fill the English Channel. Planes circle overhead, the thunder of the guns roars incessantly, and in the belly of the boats sit young men, many hardly older than 20. Their faces are tense, their hands clinging to rifles, some murmuring silent prayers, others staring silently into the churning sea. Each of them knows that the next few minutes will be the difference between life and death. They have come to overcome one of the most heavily fortified coastlines in the world. Hitler had the so-called Atlantic Wall built, a bulwark of bunkers, barbed wire, anti-tank barriers, and mines, created to destroy any attacker in the water. And yet the Allies dare to take the step on this day, because Europe, trapped under the swastika, needs liberation. The war has been raging for almost 5 years. France has been under German occupation since 1940. Belgium and the Netherlands have fallen, as have Poland and Norway. Britain has held out on its own. The Soviet Union is desperately fighting in the East, and since 1941, the United States has also entered the war. But all this is not enough. In order to overthrow Hitler, a return to Western Europe is needed, with a blow that can no longer be stopped. At this moment, on this windswept beach, the hope of millions rests on the shoulders of the men in the boats. For the oppressed people of France, for families who have been living in fear and darkness for years, every shot, every boat rolling in means the possibility of freedom returning. For the soldiers, however, it is a path into the unknown, a step out into the deadly fire of German machine guns. Many of them will not reach the beach. Some will fall in the water before their feet touch the bottom of France. But that is precisely why this day is still unforgotten today. It is not only the beginning of the liberation of Europe, but also a symbol of courage, determination, and sacrifice. June 6, 1944 shows what people are capable of when they stand up together against tyranny and oppression. But it also shows the tragedy of war. Thousands of deaths in a few hours, burning villages, a bloody beach where heroism and despair flow inseparably into each other. That day changed Europe, and it did so at a price that would never be. Chapter 2. The Prehistory: Why the Invasion Was Necessary. To understand why June 6, 1944 was so crucial for Europe, we have to go back a few years. The Second World War had long since settled over the continent like a black shadow. Since 1939, Hitler's Wehrmacht had rushed from victory to victory, overrunning countries, tearing down borders, and overthrowing governments. Poland, Norway, Denmark, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg all had fallen in a few weeks. France, once one of the most powerful nations in the world, capitulated in June 1940. One part of the country was directly occupied, the other, the so-called Vichy regime, was under German control. In one fell swoop, the map of Europe had been redrawn, and Germany ruled over almost the entire west of the continent. Great Britain was the only country to stand firm. Winston Churchill vowed never to give up, even when the situation seemed hopeless. The Battle of Britain in 1940 had shown that Hitler's power was not infinite. The Royal Air Force was able to repel the German bombing raids and thus save the island from invasion. But Britain could not wage a war of liberation alone. Allies were needed. These allies finally appeared on the scene with the entry of the USA into the war in 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had drawn the United States into the global conflict. Germany and Italy immediately declared war on the USA. Thus, the three major allies, the USA, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, stood side by side against the Axis powers. But as different as these partners were, their common goal was clear. Hitler's Germany had to be defeated. The decisive question was, how? The Soviet Union had been pushing for a second front since 1941. Millions of Soviet soldiers fought in the east against the German Wehrmacht, which was tied up in gigantic battles from Stalingrad to Kursk. Stalin repeatedly demanded that his Western allies finally attack in Western Europe in order to take the pressure off his troops. But the USA and Great Britain hesitated. A landing operation too early could have ended in disaster, as the tragic experiences at Dieppe in 1942 had shown, where a Canadian contingent was almost completely wiped out in a few hours. Nevertheless, it was clear that the war could not be won without an invasion of Western Europe. Air raids and submarine battles in the Atlantic could weaken Germany, but they would not bring down the Reich. Hitler had to be confronted on the European mainland. From 1943, after the successes in North Africa and the landings in Italy, planning began for the largest military enterprise of all time, Operation Overlord. The history of D-Day is therefore also a story of pressure, expectations, and hope. Millions of people in occupied countries were eagerly waiting for the moment when Allied soldiers would finally set foot on European soil again. Every little message, every radio message, every rumor of an imminent landing was a spark of hope in a world of oppression. At the same time, the Allies were aware that failure was not an option. A failed invasion would not only have cost hundreds of thousands of lives, but would also have prolonged the war for years with unimaginable consequences. That is why the Normandy landings were not simply a military operation. It was the answer to years of darkness, the fulfillment of the promise that democracies would return to free Europe from tyranny. June 6, 1944, was the result of a long development and the only hope of ending the war. Chapter 3. Occupied Europe. Life under the swastika. When the German troops marched into Paris in the summer of 1940, an era of freedom ended for millions of people. From one day to the next, Europe was no longer the continent of proud nations, but an empire under Hitler's rule. Swastika flags fluttered in the streets, soldiers marched through foreign cities, and the population had to learn to live with the reality of the occupation. Especially in France, the full severity of this new order was shown. German officers requisitioned houses, controlled food, and determined daily life. The inhabitants received ration cards and had to make do with rations that were barely enough to survive. Butter, meat, and sugar became a rarity, while unimaginable prices were demanded on the black market. Many families were starving, and the winter brought additional hardship. But hunger was not the only torment. Constant fear accompanied everyday life. At night, German patrols roamed the streets. Suspects were arrested, sometimes without any explanation. The Gestapo combed the cities, searched for resistance fighters, listened to conversations, and spread terror through arbitrary executions. Anyone who had the courage to distribute leaflets or pass on news from the underground risked torture or death. At the same time, the regime intervened deeply in the lives of young people. Thousands of men were deported to Germany for forced labor to toil in factories and mines. Families were torn apart, children grew up without fathers. The crew gnawed not only at the body, but also at the soul. But despite this suppression, resistance stirred. Men and women met in cellars and back rooms to write leaflets, collect weapons, and smuggle information to the Allies. They called themselves résistance, the resistance. They were farmers, teachers, students, priests, workers. Some blew up tracks to stop German transports, others hid Jewish families or helped downed pilots escape. Their courage was a silent protest against powerlessness, and it kept alive the hope that one day freedom would return. Meanwhile, life full of discord prevailed in the cities. Cafes were open, cinemas played films, trains ran, but above all, there was a feeling of foreign rule. A wrong word could mean death, a wrong gesture betrayal. Many French came to terms with the occupation, some even collaborated, others remained silent in order to survive. Europe under the swastika was a continent of contrasts. On the one hand, the seemingly orderly life, on the other hand, terror, hunger, and depression. Millions of people were waiting for a sign that this time would end. For them, the prospect of invasion was not just a military event, but a promise that tyranny could not last forever. In this way, occupied Europe became a world of fear and hope at the same time. Fear of daily repression, hope for the return of freedom.
That's exactly why D-Day was more than just a battle. For millions, it was the day when their silent prayers became reality.
Chapter 4. The Allied Plans. Operation Overlord. The Normandy landings were not a spontaneous decision, but the result of years of deliberations, agreements, and strategies. As early as 1942, when the United States had only been at war for a few months, a return to Europe was being considered. But the Allies knew that such an operation would be one of the most complex and risky in the entire history of war. A single mistake could cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and decisively change the fate of war. The generals and politicians were faced with enormous questions. Where should they land? When was the right time? Which troops were to participate? What technology was necessary? And how could Hitler's defenses be overcome? Each of these points required endless discussions, plans, and rehearsals. First of all, there was the question of the location. Many expected a landing near Calais, the shortest route across the English Channel. But that was precisely why this section was particularly heavily fortified. Instead, Normandy was chosen, a region with wide beaches suitable for landing craft, and with a location that allowed the Allies to advance equally to the west and east. It was a decision full of risk. Normandy was further away, the journey was more dangerous, but the surprise could be decisive. The question of timing was also difficult. The weather in the English Channel is unpredictable, and the landing required clear conditions: calm seas, sufficient brightness, a certain position of the moon for the paratroopers, a certain tidal position for the landing craft. Only a few days a month met these requirements. In the end, June 5, 1944 was chosen as the date, but bad weather forced it to be postponed by one day. It was to happen on the morning of June 6th. The planning was codenamed Operation Overlord, and it required a level of collaboration that had never been seen before. American, British, Canadian, French, and many other units had to be coordinated. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers have been trained, ships have been built, weapons have been delivered, supply lines have been created. Entire coasts of England were training grounds, where landings were practiced, tanks tested, and parachute jumps trained. At the top was General Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man of quiet authority whose greatest strength lay not in detailed planning, but in bringing together the different nations and personalities. In addition to him, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the British commander, and a large number of other generals played decisive roles. They all knew this undertaking was more than a battle, it was the hope for an end to the war. Operation Overlord was thus not only a question of military logistics, but also a political signal. It showed the oppressed peoples of Europe that the Allies did not just talk, but act. Every radio message from London, every secret message to the resistance was permeated by the same message: we're coming. But as enormous as the planning was, the Allies knew that another key lay in deception. Hitler was never allowed to know where and when the invasion would take place. Therefore, in addition to the preparations, a second game was staged, a game of lies, dummies and false leads that was intended to mislead the Germans. This game was called Operation Fortitude, and it was supposed to make D-Day possible in the first place.
Chapter 5. Deception and Secrecy. Operation Fortitude. As large and careful as the plans for the Normandy landings were, they would hardly have been successful if the Germans had learned of the true intentions of the Allies in advance. Hitler and his generals knew that an invasion was imminent. The only question was, where? To exploit this uncertainty, the Allies launched one of the most sophisticated deception operations in military history, Operation Fortitude. The idea was as simple as it was ingenious. The Germans were supposed to believe that the attack would not take place in Normandy, but in Pas-de-Calais, the stretch of coast closest to England. There, the crossing was shortest, the roads to Germany led directly into the Reich, and it was only logical that the Allies chose this route. Hitler himself was convinced that Calais had to be the target. It was precisely this conviction that the Allies took advantage of. To make the deception believable, they built up a mock army, the first U.S. Army group, supposedly under the command of General George S. Patton. Patton was the most aggressive and capable American commander in the eyes of the Germans, and the news that he was allegedly gathering troops in southern England for an invasion seemed only logical. But this army did not exist. It consisted of inflatable tanks, wooden planes, false radio exchanges, and improvised camps that looked real from the air. Entire radio stations broadcast fake news that gave the impression that hundreds of thousands of soldiers were waiting to be deployed. The British Secret Service also played a decisive role. With a network of double agents feeding Germany with seemingly valuable information, the deception was perfected. Every step, every movement that the Germans observed confirmed their own prejudice. The attack would take place near Calais. Even after the Normandy landings had already begun, many German generals still clung to this conviction and refused to withdraw reserves from Calais. In addition to the great strategic deception, there were countless little tricks. Airplanes dropped aluminum strips to confuse radar systems. Commandos secretly landed on coasts only to leave traces that looked like preparations for an invasion. Seemingly harmless radio messages, rumors in occupied cities, even forged maps, everything served one goal: to confuse the Germans and prevent them from moving their forces to Normandy in time. The effect was enormous. Hitler had his strongest tank divisions held back at Calais, even weeks after the actual landing. He was convinced that Normandy was only a diversionary tactic and that the real blow was yet to come. This miscalculation saved the lives of countless Allied soldiers and gave the invading troops time to consolidate their bridgehead. Operation Fortitude was therefore more than just a side plan. It was a masterpiece of cunning, deception, and psychological warfare. Without them, D-Day might have failed in the hail of bullets from the German armored divisions. But thanks to this gigantic illusion, the Allies were able to gain the decisive advantage: the surprise factor.
Chapter 6: The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's Fortress Europe. When the Allies developed their plans to return to Europe, it was clear to them that the greatest enemy would not only be the Wehrmacht itself, but also the fortress that Hitler had built along the coasts of Western Europe, the so-called Atlantic Wall. This gigantic defensive work stretched from Norway to the French-Spanish border and was intended to make the Third Reich invincible. In Hitler's propaganda, the Atlantic Wall was an impenetrable barrier, a steel and concrete wall against any invasion. In fact, the Atlantic Wall was a mixture of reality and illusion. Thousands of bunkers, gun emplacements, and shelters were built along the coast. Particularly in strategically important regions such as Calais or Normandy, huge defensive structures were built. Concrete bunkers with meter-thick walls protruded into the dunes, containing cannons that could threaten ships far out at sea. Minefields and barbed wire barriers were built. Tank traps and so-called hump obstacles were to smash landing craft and tanks on the beach. But the reality was often different from what Hitler described in speeches. Much was still incomplete, some sections only provisionally secured. The construction devoured vast quantities of concrete, steel, and manpower, and often there was simply a lack of materials. Forced laborers from occupied countries had to build the facilities, many under catastrophic conditions. For them, the Atlantic Wall did not mean protection, but agony and death. Despite these shortcomings, the fortress was a serious obstacle. Especially in Normandy, the German defenders had months to expand their positions. Machine gun nests were created in such a way that they could fire at entire sections of beach crosswise. Artillery pieces were hidden in camouflage and could destroy landing craft as they approached. Every possible landing site was peppered with concrete blocks, anti-tank barriers, and wooden piles that lurked invisibly in the water at high tide. At the head of the defense was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. After his successes in North Africa, he had been deployed in the West to secure the coastline. Rommel was convinced that an invasion could only be stopped in the first few hours. Once the Allies succeeded in establishing a bridgehead, he estimated, the superiority of material and air support could no longer be stopped. That's why he pushed for maximum defense right on the beach. Rommel personally inspected the coasts, had additional mines laid, obstacles erected, and farmers' fields flooded to prevent paratroopers from landing. He knew that time was of the essence and openly stated that the Atlantic Wall was only a myth if it was not reinforced with all its might. But there were differences of opinion within the German leadership. While Rommel relied on a rigid defense on the beach, other generals considered it better to station the armored divisions further in the rear in order to be able to react flexibly. This disagreement was to have fatal consequences on D-Day. For the Allies, the Atlantic Wall was a nightmare that was present in every training manual, in every planning room. The soldiers knew that they would run towards beaches that were riddled with mines and were covered in a hail of bullets. They knew that every meter had to be fought for to survive. And yet, there was also a weakness in this fortress. It could not foresee the size of the attack. She could not break the will of the men to move forward despite all the obstacles. Thus, the Atlantic Wall became a symbol of Hitler's megalomania, a gigantic structure that was supposed to seem insurmountable but was ultimately defeated by determination, courage, and sheer superiority.
Chapter 7. The Men of D-Day, Soldiers from Around the World. When you think of D-Day today, you often see images of American soldiers heading to the coast in landing craft on Omaha or Utah Beach. But the army that entered Normandy on June 6, 1944, was much more than just an American force. It was an army made up of many nations, convened to achieve a common goal, the liberation of Europe. At the forefront were the American soldiers. More than 70,000 men of the U.S. Army were deployed that day. They came from all parts of the country: farm boys from Iowa, students from New York, miners from Pennsylvania. Many of them had never seen Europe before. Some were abroad for the first time ever. For them, Normandy was a foreign country, but they knew that their task was decisive for the fate of the world. Next to them fought the British, almost as numerous, marked by years of resistance. They had seen the German Luftwaffe over their cities. They had survived the darkness of lightning, and now they were bringing their experience to the battlefield. At Gold and Sword Beach, they stormed ashore, supported by their famous tanks, the Hobart's Funnies, which had been specially designed to overcome obstacles, clear mines, and lay bridges. The Canadians played a central role. More than 14,000 soldiers from Canada landed at Juno Beach, many of them young, full of energy and pride to do their part. They met with fierce resistance, lost hundreds of comrades that day, but they broke up the German lines and advanced further inland than many would have expected. But D-Day was not just an operation of the big nations. Smaller countries also played their part. Norwegians, Poles, Czechs, Belgians, Dutch, even Luxembourgers fought side by side with the Allies. Many of them had lost their homes to the occupation. Some fought in exile units. Others had waited years to finally march against Hitler again. For them, it was not just a military mission, but a personal mission. Not to forget the French themselves. Although their country had been occupied since 1840, numerous soldiers had made their way to Great Britain and were now fighting in the ranks of the Free French Armed Forces. They were organized under General Charles de Gaulle and took part in the invasion. For them, D-Day was a return to their own homeland, a step back to French soil occupied by enemies. Countless sailors and airmen also stood on the side of the ground troops. Without the sailors who steered the ships, operated the artillery, or took the wounded on board, the invasion would not have been possible. Without the pilots who secured the sky, bombed German positions, or dropped supplies, the men on the beach would have had no chance. D-Day was therefore more than a battle. It was a joint work of the free world. Men from different cultures, languages, and backgrounds fought together, shoulder to shoulder. Many did not understand the language of their comrades, but they understood the goal. They knew that this day decided the future, and that each and every one of them was part of a story that was bigger than themselves. For many, it was to be the last day of their lives. Thousands died on the beaches, but their sacrifice combined to form a message that still resonates today. Freedom can never be taken for granted. It must be defended, fought for, and sometimes paid for at the highest price.
Chapter 8. The Night Before. Paratroopers Behind the Lines. Even before the first landing craft reached the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6th, the invasion had already begun. In the darkness of the night, high above France. Thousands of paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, as well as British and Canadian units, jumped off behind the German lines. Their task was enormous and risky at the same time. They were to secure bridges, block roads, destroy radio stations, and delay the advance of the Germans on the beaches. The men who jumped out of the planes that night were heavily packed. In addition to weapons and ammunition, they carried parachute packages, equipment, often over 40 kilograms of load. In the dim lighting of the cabins, they stared at the red lamps above the doors that would indicate the moment of jumping. Some prayed, others held photos of their families in their hands, and still others tried to break the tension with black humor. But when the doors sprang open and the cold night air came in, it was clear to everyone that things were getting serious. The jump was chaotic. Many planes were shot at by German anti-aircraft guns, machines caught fire, squads were scattered over wide areas. Some soldiers landed in the middle of swamps and drowned, others hung in trees or fell directly into German positions. What was supposed to start as a planned, coordinated operation developed into a wild, confusing fight in the dark. But it was precisely this chaos that gave rise to an advantage. Allied soldiers suddenly appeared everywhere in the villages and fields of Normandy. Small groups attacked patrols, cut telephone lines, destroyed bridges, and planted explosives on roads. German units soon no longer knew where the enemy stood, how strong he was, and where he was moving. The paratroopers sowed confusion and paralyzed the Wehrmacht's ability to react in the crucial hours before landing. The battles for the bridges at Sainte-Mère-Église and Pegasus Bridge became particularly famous. Sainte-Mère-Église went down in history as one of the first liberated villages in France after American paratroopers conquered it and defended it against German counterattacks. Pegasus Bridge, in turn, was captured by British glider troops. A daring operation in which the gliders landed just a few meters from the bridge and the men overwhelmed the surprised defenders. This bridge was crucial to prevent the advance of reinforcements and to secure Allied access to the interior. For the paratroopers, this night was a hellish trip. They did not fight in large formations, but often in small groups, cut off from each other, surrounded by enemies. They had to improvise, look for paths through hedges and fields, hide in villages, or suddenly attack. Many lost comrades while jumping. Others fell in the first minutes of battle. But despite all the losses, they fulfilled their task. They tied up German forces, they confused the enemy, and they created the space that the men on the beach needed to have any chance at all. When the first rays of sunlight fell over the coast at dawn, the work of the paratroopers had long been underway. They had used the night to prepare the ground for the landing. Their commitment, full of courage and willingness to make sacrifices, was the invisible but decisive prerequisite for ensuring that D-Day didn't fail in its first hours. Chapter 9, Dawn on June 6, Beginning of the Invasion. The morning of June 6, 1944, began gray, windy, and wet. A thin fog lay over the English Channel as the massive invasion fleet set off. More than 5,000 ships of all sizes, landing craft, destroyers, cruisers, freighters, formed the largest armada formation in history. From the coasts of England, the tremendous movement had been observed during the night. An endless band of ships pushing towards France, accompanied by the roar of engines and the thunder of the sea. In the boats sat the soldiers, tightly packed, wet from the splashing water and the spray that hit them in the face. Many were seasick, some vomited in helmets or over the railing, but no one talked about it. Everyone knew that the biggest test was still to come. Some stared silently at the dark sea, others held on to their weapons as if they were a talisman. The thunder of artillery could already be heard in the distance as the Allied warships began to fire on the German positions on the coast. Then came the signal. Air squadrons took off, thundered over the beaches, and dropped bombs on the fortifications. In theory, this hail of bombs was supposed to smash defenses, destroy bunkers, blow up mines. In practice, however, many bombs missed their targets because the fog impaired visibility. The beaches were far less damaged than had been hoped, a circumstance that the men in the landing craft soon felt in a terrible way. When the boats finally approached the coasts, the sea turned into an inferno. German machine guns opened fire, bullets rained down on the sides of boats, grenades exploded in the water. The stench of smoke, oil, and blood hung over the waves.
For many soldiers, there was no turning back. As soon as the ramps of the boats were lowered, they had to go out into the ice-cold water, often up to their chests or necks. Loaded with heavy equipment, some stumbled, sank before they even reached the beach. Those who made it ran across open sand, while bullets struck around them and comrades fell. The noise was deafening, the rattle of machine guns, the thunder of cannons, the screams of the wounded. Men threw themselves into craters and hollows, sought cover behind obstacles, while officers desperately tried to bring order to the chaos. But despite the hell they were thrown into, they advanced. Centimeter by centimeter, meter by meter, they crawled, ran, jumped on. Behind them, new waves of soldiers pushed onto the beach, supported by tanks that rolled out of special landing craft. Some vehicles got stuck or were torn apart by mines, but others made it and provided cover that gave the men protection. D-Day was not a clean operation that morning, but a fight for bare survival. And yet, something happened that could not be planned. Courage. Courage of individual men who rushed forward under fire, cut through wire entanglements, knocked out bunkers with grenades. Courage of small groups that gathered and attacked the enemy. Courage that continued like a chain and made it possible for the Allies to gain a foothold despite all the losses. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the largest invasion in history began, and with it, the fight for the future of Europe.
Chapter 10. Utah Beach, the Happy Beach. Of all 5 beaches where the Allies landed on June 6, 1944, Utah Beach would be the one where luck was strongest with the attackers. Around 23,000 American soldiers of the 4th Infantry Division landed here, supported by units of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, which had already been dropped behind the lines the night before. Actually, the landing had been planned differently. Due to strong currents and navigational errors, the boats dropped the men more than a kilometer south of the designated section. In a situation that could easily have led to chaos and confusion, however, the advantage of this mishap became apparent. Exactly where the soldiers went ashore, the German defenses were weaker than expected. When the first waves reached the beach, they were met with machine gun fire, but the resistance was comparatively low. Unlike on bloody Omaha Beach, the men managed to quickly find cover and overcome obstacles. Within a few hours, they had secured the beach and began to advance inland. A key factor was the interaction with the paratroopers who had been dropped off the night before. Although many of them had landed scattered and suffered heavy losses, they had blown up bridges, blocked roads, and tied up German reinforcements. This allowed the soldiers to advance relatively quickly on Utah Beach and secure important connections. The commander of the landing troops, General Theodore Roosevelt Jr., the son of the former U.S. president, played a special role in this. Despite severe arthritis and health problems, he insisted on going ashore with the first wave. When he noticed that the landing had taken place far from the intended point, he is said to have said with calm composure, "We are landing here. We will start the mission from here." His decision not to go back but to move forward immediately contributed significantly to the success. Nevertheless, Utah Beach cost many victims, around 200 killed that day. But in relation to the size of the operation and what the comrades had to suffer on other beaches, the losses were comparatively small. That's why Utah Beach went down in history as the Happy Beach. From here, the Americans were able to secure an important bridgehead and establish contact with the paratroopers fighting in the rear. Utah Beach thus became not only a tactical success, but also a moral one. It proved that the landing was possible, that the massive invasion did not have to fail in the fire of the Atlantic Wall. Chapter 11. Omaha Beach, the Bloody Hell. While Utah Beach seemed comparatively merciful to Americans, Omaha Beach became synonymous with suffering, sacrifice, and unimaginable bravery. On the morning of June 6, 1944, around 34,000 soldiers of the 1st and 29th U.S. Infantry Divisions landed here. The beach was about 8 kilometers long, framed by steep cliffs and riddled with obstacles. And this is exactly where one of the most heavily fortified German defense lines of the entire Atlantic Wall awaited. The German troops, mostly members of the 352nd Infantry Division, were battle-hardened and had prepared their positions well. Machine guns were lying in bunkers and casemates, which fired at the beach sections crosswise. Mortars and artillery were positioned in such a way that they could target any landing craft. The beach itself was peppered with mines, barbed wire, and wooden poles that were supposed to stop tanks and vehicles. When the first waves of landing craft touched down on the beach, a veritable inferno broke out. Machine gun fire hammered non-stop, shells exploded in the water, boats were hit and shredded. Many soldiers have already been shot or drowned in the water because they could not swim with their heavy equipment. Those who made it to the beach alive found little cover. Only narrow dunes and craters offered protection from the continuous fire. The scenes that unfolded were apocalyptic. The wounded screamed for help. Men desperately sought cover while their comrades were hit next to them. Radios fell into the water, commands were lost, officers were shot before they could give orders. Entire units were wiped out before they could even form a formation. For hours, it seemed as if the landing at Omaha Beach would fail. But in the midst of the chaos, there were men who refused to give up. Small groups gathered, crawled forward under a hail of bullets, threw grenades into bunkers, and searched for ways through barbed wire and minefields. Sappers blew gaps in the obstacles, while infantrymen crawled up the beach centimeter by centimeter. The deployment of the Rangers, who landed on the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, became particularly famous. Their task was to eliminate the German guns that threatened the beaches. With ropes and ladders, they climbed up the steep rocks, under constant fire from above. Many fell before they reached the cliffs, but the survivors captured the positions and carried out their mission, even if they themselves suffered the heaviest losses. At the end of the day, the Americans had actually managed to hold a bridgehead, but the price was appalling. Around 2,000 men died or were wounded on Omaha Beach. The beach, littered with destroyed vehicles, equipment, and countless bodies, became a symbol of the cruelty of war and of the courage of those who continued to fight against all odds. Omaha Beach was the bloodiest episode of D-Day, but also the one that most impressively showed that determination could break even the strongest defenses. The beach, which had looked like a death trap in the morning, was in Allied hands in the evening, and with it, a piece of hope for the end of the war. Chapter 12. Gold Beach, the British Advance. While the Americans were fighting for survival at Omaha Beach, British troops landed at Gold Beach further east. The 50th British Infantry Division was deployed here, supported by special forces and tanks that had been specially developed for this mission. Their goal was to conquer the city of Bahia, secure important road connections, and finally establish contact with the Canadians at Juno Beach and the British at Sword Beach. Gold Beach differed from Omaha in many ways. Although bunkers, mines, and barbed wire had to be overcome here as well, the British planners had learned from the mistakes of earlier operations. At the forefront of the landing were so-called Hobart's Funnies, custom-made tanks that could clear obstacles, lay bridges, overcome trenches, or even use flamethrowers. These curious-looking vehicles often made the decisive difference when it came to breaking through German defenses. The resistance on the beach was fierce, but not as devastating as on Omaha. German positions immediately opened fire. Machine guns and artillery tried to stop the boats, but British naval support was precise, destroying many fortifications before the infantry went ashore. Step by step, the men worked their way from the beach to the interior. Particularly difficult was the capture of the village of Le Hamel, where a strongly developed German resistance nest bunker was located. Here, British troops fought fiercely, supported by their special tanks, until they were finally able to eliminate the defenders. This victory opened the way for further advance. By the evening, the British had made considerable progress at Gold Beach. They advanced several kilometers inland, secured important roads, and stood close to Bahia, which was to be the first major city in France to be liberated from the Allies the next day. They had thus largely achieved their goal, a success that further increased the pressure on the German defenders. Nevertheless, the price was high. Around 1,000 British soldiers fell or were wounded. But compared to Omaha, the bridgehead was relatively stable, and the advance was faster than expected. Gold Beach thus became a central building block of the invasion, from which the Allies could join forces and expand further east and west. For the British soldiers, this day meant not only military success, but also a moment of satisfaction. After years of bombing, after the threat of a German invasion of their own island, they now stood on French soil themselves and began the reconquer of Europe. Chapter 13. Juno Beach, Canadian Courage in a Hail of Bullets. Between the British landing zones at Golden Sword lay Juno Beach, the section assigned to Canadian troops. Over 14,000 soldiers of the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, supported by tanks and special troops, went ashore here. For many of them, it was the first major mission in Europe, and it was to be one of the toughest. Already on the march to the beach, the Canadians met fierce resistance. The German defenses were particularly well developed here. Bunkers, machine gun nests, minefields, and artillery positions covered the entire coastal area. In addition, the first landing craft arrived late due to the weather, a circumstance that gave the defenders additional time to prepare their positions. As the ramps of the boats went down, the beach turned into an inferno. Machine gun fire whipped across the sand. Grenades tore craters into the ranks of the attackers. Many soldiers have already been hit in the water. Others got stuck in the barbed wire or perished in mine explosions. In the first few minutes, the first wave lost almost half of its men, a devastating rate reminiscent of the scenes of Omaha. And yet, the Canadians did not give up. With incredible determination, they fought their way forward, took cover, blew up obstacles, and attacked bunkers. Particularly impressive was the use of small groups that acted independently, exploited gaps, and made the breakthrough with courage and initiative. By noon on June 6th, the Canadians had left the beach behind and advanced inland. They took several villages, destroyed German positions, and pushed further north. Of all the Allied troops, they advanced the furthest that day, up to 10 kilometers inland, closer to the strategically important city of Caen than any other unit. But the price was high. Around 1,200 Canadian soldiers were killed or wounded. Behind them lay a beach littered with destroyed vehicles, fallen comrades, and traces of fierce fighting. But in their hearts, they carried the pride of having achieved the seemingly impossible, securing the bridgehead at Juno Beach and clearing the way to France's hearts. For Canada, this day was more than a military victory. It was proof that a country far from Europe was willing to make sacrifices to defend freedom and democracy. Juno Beach thus became a symbol of Canadian courage, and a place where the young nation proved its role in world history.
Chapter 14. Sword Beach. The Scots storm France. The easternmost landing sector on D-Day was Sword Beach, assigned to the British troops of the 3rd Infantry Division. Around 29,000 soldiers landed here, supported by special forces, tanks, and a small but determined detachment of French soldiers who fought side by side with the British. Their goal was ambitious: to capture the strategically important city of Caen, only 15 kilometers from the beach. When the first landing craft reached the coast in the morning, a deadly dance of fire, smoke, and chaos began here as well. German machine guns and artillery immediately opened fire. Mines and barbed wire blocked the way, and the current tore off some boats. The first waves that entered the beach with heavy losses were hit particularly hard. But the British had prepared. With the support of the Royal Navy and the use of its special tanks, the Hobart's Funnies, it was possible to clear obstacles, knock out bunkers, and gain land step by step. The Scottish regiments, accompanied by bagpipers, who encouraged the men with their sounds, stormed the beach. This image, soldiers going ashore under a hail of bullets while music is playing, should be deeply engraved in the memory. By the afternoon, Sword Beach was largely secured, and British units began to advance inland. But here they met with fierce resistance. In particular, the 21st Panzer Division, the only German panzer division nearby, attacked several times to throw the invasion back into the sea. In fierce battles, the Allies had to hold their positions, supported by air raids and naval guns. However, the actual goal of the day, the capture of Caen, could not be achieved. The Germans defended the city with all their might, and it was to remain fought over for weeks. Nevertheless, the British had established a stable bridgehead at Sword Beach, from which they could launch further operations. For the French, who had landed with the British, this day was of special importance. Under the command of Commander Philippe Kiefer, around 170 French commandos stormed the beach. A small but symbolically enormously important contribution.
For the first time since 1940, French soldiers returned to their homeland in regular formation in the fight against the occupiers. Sword Beach thus stood for the courage, determination, and international character of the invasion. British, Scots, French, they all fought on this beach and paved the way that would eventually lead to Caen and beyond. The price was high, but the goal of establishing a foothold in Europe was achieved. Chapter 15: The Fighting in the Hinterland, Bocage, Hedge Wars, and Tanks. After the beaches were secured on June 6th, the real battle for Normandy began, and it was to prove as difficult as the landing itself. The Allies had built their bridgeheads, but the way inland did not lead over open plains, but through a landscape that was to become hell for attackers, the so-called bocage. The bocage was a labyrinth of narrow fields surrounded by high hedges and mounds. These hedges, often several meters thick and provided with deep ditches, had grown over centuries and offered ideal defensive positions. For the farmers of Normandy, they were protection for fields and livestock. For the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, they became natural fortresses. Every dirt road, every village could thus become a deadly ambush. For the American and British troops who came from more open landscapes, this hedge war was a nightmare. Tanks could hardly maneuver because they were blocked by the hedges. Infantry had to fight their way through narrow passages, while German machine guns and snipers waited perfectly camouflaged. Often, the enemy was not seen before he opened fire. Entire units were mowed down in a few minutes. In addition, the Germans transferred their best troops to Normandy. Panzer divisions, including the dreaded 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Youth and the Panzer Lehr Division, soon arrived. Their soldiers were young, fanatical, and excellently equipped. Supported by heavy tanks such as the Tiger and Panther, they made any Allied advance expensive. The Allies had to learn to deal with this new way of fighting. Engineers built special devices on tanks, so-called rhino tanks, which could break open hedges with welded steel tines. Infantry and tanks worked more closely together. Artillery and air support were used specifically to destroy German positions. But all this happened slowly, with high losses and enormous effort. For weeks, the battle raged in the bocage, village after village, hedge after hedge. For the soldiers, it was a war of nerves. Every step could trigger a mine. Every hedge could hide an ambush. The enemy was invisible, the danger omnipresent. Many veterans described the bocage as one of the most grueling experiences of their lives. Worse than the beaches, because there was no clear goal here, only endless, bloody fights. And yet, the Allies managed to advance slowly but steadily. With every conquered village, with every broken line, the Germans' hope of being able to throw the invasion back into the sea faded. The hedge war took a terrible toll, but it paved the way for the major offensives that were soon to follow. Operation Cobra in the American sector, and the fighting for Caen among the British and Canadians. The Battle of the Bocage made it clear that while D-Day was a decisive step, the real struggle for the liberation of Europe had only just begun.
Chapter 16: The French Resistance, Helpers in the Shadows. While Allied soldiers fought on the beaches and laboriously worked their way through the bocage, there were people in the cities, villages, and forests of Normandy who had been working secretly for years towards this moment, the fighters of the resistance. They were not an army in the classical sense, but peasants, teachers, students, workers, priests, and ordinary citizens who had decided not to bow to the occupation. Their weapons were rarely modern. Often they were old rifles, stolen pistols, or homemade explosive devices. But their main strength was camouflage. They were part of the population, invisible and yet dangerous. The resistance had already played an important role before D-Day. They collected information about German troop movements, drew maps of fortifications, reported supply routes and radio stations. With risky missions, they delivered this data to the Allies, often via secret radios or couriers who risked their lives on every trip. Even a suspicion could mean imprisonment, torture, or death, and yet they carried on. In the days around D-Day, their mission reached a climax. After secret codes sent to France via the BBC, the resistance began to intensify its sabotage actions, Bridges were blown up, trains derailed, telephone lines cut. Entire railway lines were paralyzed so that German reinforcements did not reach the front in time. Roads were blocked, vehicles were attacked, supplies stolen. Each attack meant a little bit more confusion, and taken together, they were crucial to the success of the invasion. Especially in Normandy, the resistance helped the Allied paratroopers. Many groups made contact with the deposed soldiers, hid them, guided them through forests, or provided them with maps. Some families opened their homes, even though they knew that the Gestapo would shoot them immediately if they were discovered. It was an act of courage and sacrifice that happened quietly, but without which the Allies could have fought much harder. But the price was high. The Germans reacted brutally to the resistance. Entire villages were burned down, civilians shot, hostages taken. In Oradour-sur-Glane, far away from Normandy, the extent of the cruelty became apparent. More than 600 inhabitants were murdered by an SS unit, men, women, children. This massacre was representative of the suffering inflicted by the resistance, but also of the fear of the occupiers, who felt that control was slipping away. The resistance was not the great army that Hitler feared, but it was an invisible net that weakened his power. They were the helpers in the shadows, quietly ensuring that D-Day was won not only on the beaches, but also on the roads, bridges, and rails of occupied France. For many of the fighters, the summer of 1944 meant the end of a nightmare that had lasted for years. As the Allies advanced, they came forward openly, threw on their armbands with the cross of the resistance, and took up arms side by side with regular troops. At last, they could fight freely, no longer in the shadows, but in the light of liberation.
Chapter 17. Hitler's Reactions, Confusion and Wrong Decisions. When the news of the Normandy landings arrived at Hitler's headquarters in the early morning hours of June 6, 1944, the reaction was anything but decisive. The Führer had taken medication the night before and was fast asleep, so that his generals did not let him wake up at first. At a moment when every hour decided the fate of Europe, Hitler lay asleep while thousands of men risked their lives on the beaches of Normandy. Even more serious, however, was the confusion within the German leadership. They had been expecting an Allied invasion for months, but no one knew where it would take place. Many generals were convinced that Normandy was only a distraction and that the real attack would take place at Pas de Calais. This conviction was the result of the masterful deception of the Allies, Operation Fortitude. Even as reports of the extent of the fighting in Normandy increased, some generals rigidly held on to the assumption that the real goal was yet to come. Hitler himself shared this view. He was convinced that Calais was the logical target of the Allies, and therefore he refused to withdraw the armored divisions stationed there. These divisions, including some of the strongest and best-equipped troops, remained inactive while fierce fighting raged in Normandy. It was a miscalculation that gave the Allies the necessary time to secure and strengthen their bridgeheads. In addition, there was the problem of command. The German tank reserves were not allowed to be used without Hitler's explicit consent. However, since he slept at first and hesitated later, crucial hours were lost. Field Marshal Rommel, who organized the defense of the coast, was not even on site at the time. He had taken leave to celebrate his wife's birthday, believing that the bad weather would make it impossible to land in the next few days. When Hitler finally took action, he made decisions that were not intended to improve the course of the battle, but to make it worse. Instead of throwing the tank forces together against the beaches, they were deployed in fragments. Attacks were delayed, poorly coordinated, and often without sufficient air support. The Allies, who had meanwhile consolidated their position, were able to repel these attacks. The combination of deception, rigid thinking, and Hitler's propensity to want to control every strategic decision himself meant that the Germans missed their best chance to repel the invasion on the beach. While the Allied soldiers sacrificed blood and courage, time was wasted on the German side, time that saved the invasion. For many historians, this is precisely the crucial point. Not only the strength and determination of the Allies, but also the confusion and wrong decisions of the German leadership made the success of D-Day possible. The day on which Europe regained its freedom was also a day on which Hitler's weaknesses became openly visible. stubbornness, mistrust, and a disastrous adherence to false convictions. Chapter 18. The Price of Victory: Losses, Suffering, and Destruction. June 6, 1944 went down in history as a day of hope and courage, but it was also a day of suffering. Victory on the beaches of Normandy came at a high price, a price paid in blood, tears, and destruction. Even the first few hours took a terrible toll. At Omaha Beach, where the Americans ended up in the crossfire of German machine guns, around 2,000 men were killed. On the other beaches, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, hundreds of soldiers also lost their lives. In total, the Allies counted over 10,000 casualties on D-Day alone, including more than 4,000 casualties. For every family that lost a son, brother, or father, this day was a step towards the liberation of Europe, but at the same time, a personal misfortune that left wounds that never healed. The civilian population also paid a high price. The bombings that were to pave the way for the landings hit not only bunkers and positions, but also villages and towns. Houses burned, entire streets were reduced to rubble. In Normandy, thousands of French civilians, peasants, children, old people, died on that one day, victims of a battle that was supposed to bring them back to freedom. The German side also suffered heavy losses. Many young men, often ill-equipped and exhausted from the years of war, fought to the last because they knew no retreat. For them, D-Day meant the beginning of the end, and for many, the end of their lives. The beaches and fields of France became mass graves in which Germans and Allies, liberators and occupiers, lay side by side. But the price of victory was not only evident in numbers. The destruction of the landscape, the ruins of the villages, the streams of refugees from the civilian population, all this shaped the image of Normandy in the summer of 1944. Families who had suffered under the occupation for years now had to endure suffering again as the war literally swept through their homes. And yet, in the midst of the destruction, there were also moments of hope. French villagers embracing their liberators, children waving gratefully to the soldiers, women sharing bread and wine even though they had hardly anything themselves. These scenes made the soldiers aware that their sacrifice was not in vain, that behind all the suffering, the light of freedom awaited. D-Day therefore remains a day full of contradictions, a day of triumph, but also one of the bloodiest days of the war, a day that brought liberation to Europe, but at the same time cost countless lives. The price of victory was high, but it laid the foundation for the end of National Socialist rule. Chapter 19. The Liberation of Paris, Symbol of a New Europe. After the fierce fighting in Normandy, after the breakthrough from the Bocage and Operation Cobra in the American sector, the Allied troops began to advance deep into the interior of the country in the late summer of 1944. Villages and towns that had been under the swastika for years were liberated. The advance picked up speed, and soon all eyes were on the heart of France, Paris. Paris was more than just a capital. It was a symbol of culture, history, freedom. German soldiers had dominated the streets of the city since 1940. The image of the Wehrmacht marching under the Triumphal Arch had become an icon of the occupation. But now, the opposite was to happen. Paris was to become a symbol of liberation. As early as August 1944, unrest began in the city itself. The resistance organized uprisings, barricades were erected, shots echoed through the streets. The people did not want to wait any longer. They wanted to liberate their city themselves before it could be destroyed in the fighting of the advance. This uprising was risky because German troops were still present, and Paris was under the command of General Dietrich von Choltitz, who was subordinate to Hitler as city commander. Hitler himself is said to have ordered that Paris should not be surrendered without a fight. If the city were to fall, it would be destroyed, with blown-up bridges, burned buildings, destroyed monuments. Paris must not fall unharmed into the hands of the enemy, he is said to have said. But von Choltitz, who knew about the senselessness and cruelty of this order, silently resisted. He decided not to destroy the city, but ultimately to hand it over to the Allies. On August 25, 1944, the first Allied units marched into Paris.
led by French soldiers from the 2nd Panzer Division under General Leclerc. For the population, it was the moment they had been waiting for 4 years. Crowds of people poured into the streets, cheered, hoisted the tricolor out of the windows, kissed and embraced the liberators. It was a rush of joy, a collective sigh of relief after years of oppression. On the same day, Charles de Gaulle gave a famous speech at the Hôtel de Ville. He declared in a firm voice that Paris was liberated. Liberated by itself. Liberated by its people with the support of the armies of France, with the support of all France that is fighting. His words gave the liberation a national dignity that brought France back onto the political stage. The liberation of Paris was not the largest military operation of the war, and yet it was of inestimable symbolic importance. It showed that the nightmare of the occupation ended. It was a signal to all of Europe that freedom could return, and it marked a decisive step on the road to victory over the Third Reich. Paris, the city of light, shone again, not only in reality, but also as a symbol of a new Europe that regained hope after years of darkness.
Chapter 20. Reverberations. Why D-Day is still unforgotten today. June 6, 1944 was decades ago, but its significance is still alive today. D-Day was not just a military operation, it was a turning point in world history. It marked the beginning of the end of National Socialist Germany, the step towards the liberation of Europe, and the birth of a new order that still shapes the continent today. For the Allies, the success in Normandy was proof that cooperation could be stronger than any tyranny. Americans, British, Canadians, French, Poles, Norwegians, and many other nations fought side by side, united not by language or origin, but by a common goal: freedom. This international solidarity laid the foundations for the Europe that would emerge after the war, and for the close partnership between the United States and Western Europe. But the reverberations of D-Day are not only political or strategic. He lives in the stories of the men who fought on the beaches that day, in their courage, their fear, their sacrifices. Many of them were simple young men who were torn from their everyday lives and suddenly found themselves in the greatest battle of their lives. Some returned, but many did not. Their names are now inscribed in cemeteries in Normandy, in endless rows of white crosses and stars of David, commemorating their sacrifice. The civilian population of Normandy also bears the traces of D-Day to this day. In many villages, monuments commemorate the liberators, museums preserve history, and every year people from all over the world gather to honor the day. For the residents, June 6th was a day of joy, but also a day of pain, because with freedom came destruction, death, and suffering. Why does D-Day remain unforgotten? Because it shows us how fragile freedom is and how much courage and sacrifice are needed to defend it. He reminds us that history does not go for the better by itself, but through the actions of people who are willing to risk everything. Today, when veterans tell their memories or younger generations visit the beaches, D-Day becomes a memorial against war and oppression, but also a symbol of hope and cohesion. June 6, 1944 remains a day that changed Europe forever and whose legacy will accompany us for a long time to come.